We also have Derek R. Ford. Derek is a teacher, an educational theorist, and an organizer currently serving as Associate Professor of Education Studies at DePauw University. Ford has published 8 monographs, including Encountering Education, Elements for a Marxist Pedagogy, which we had the honor to release through ISCRA in 2022 this year, and Marxism, Pedagogy, and the General Intellect, Beyond the Knowledge Economy in 2021. And we also have an upcoming book of Derek's coming out, which should be coming out by the end of the year or very early next year. So keep an eye out for that. Ford organized the latest U.S. delegation to the DPRK, or the last delegation to the DPRK before the U.S. imposed travel ban, and together with Kiyul, Chung, and Malott, leads the only U.S. academic exchange program with Korea University in Japan.
Thank you, everybody, for organizing this, and of course, to Riley and Cambria for editing, and everybody at ISCRA for putting this out. In March of 2020, which was just when we in the United States were beginning some kind of quote unquote lockdown for COVID, the Japanese government was distributing protective equipment to all the schools in Japan, of which there are Japanese schools, and then there's a series of private schools, and there's very different schools for nationals, Chinese schools, and there's American schools, and there's also Korean schools. And every single school received, face masks, for example, except for the Korean schools. And it was only after really a protracted struggle involving international groups, including the United Nations, that the Korean students in Japan were able to get face masks, right? I mean, the most sort of basic, elemental, right, protective equipment during that time. And I think that, like, in order to understand the sort of like really disgusting nature of how something so basic could be provided to everybody except this one group, right? This one ethnic group. It's important precisely to understand the role that education plays in, in the human project, in the Socialist project, and the national liberation, the anti-colonial projects. And so we we just returned yesterday, about 24 hours ago, or actually about 12 hours ago, we returned from the first U.S. academic peace delegation to visit the Koreans in Japan. The first time that we've been able to go since before the pandemic. And the 2 years prior to the pandemic, we had organized official academic exchanges between my university, DePauw University, and Korea University, which is a university affiliated with Chung, the General Association of Korean Residents in Japan. And each time was really an incredible experience, an educational experience through education, about education. And so I wanted to speak a little bit about that, because it's one thing to look to, read the words of Kim Il-sung from 1977, and then another to sort of think about how they play out in a sort of related, but, quite different context, 50 years later, 40 years later. But to do that, it's sort of, the situation of Koreans in Japan and the role of education there, is unknown to so many people. And so just a couple of sort of remarks to situate this particular educational project, this project of socialist and also anti-colonial education. There are many reasons that Koreans live in Japan today, but primarily it's the result of Japanese colonialism, through which most Koreans were really forced to go to Japan, either because their land was taken from them through Japanese colonial rule, or they were brought over as forced slave laborers, including sexual slave laborers. And really in the first half of the 20th century, there were millions of Koreans living in Japan, really building Japan, its infrastructure, right? Working in the mines, building the roads, building the railways, the dams, and so on and so forth. And even though they were colonial subjects, and just as the Koreans in Korea in the peninsula were subjected to the most brutal racist colonial practices that are just common for colonialism, the deprivation of their culture, right, being forced to take on Japanese names, and so on and so forth, that also happened in Japan, although they did have Japanese citizenship, which is somewhat unique. When the Japanese Empire was defeated in 1945, The situation on the peninsula, of course, was quite unstable. About 90% of the Koreans in Japan came from what is now, South Korea, the Republic of Korea, because that's the closest sort of geographically to Japan. And there was a period of uncertainty. And then when the Korean War broke out, the US war against Korea broke out between 1950 and 1953. It sort of, although nobody accepted that the division of the peninsula would be permanent, there was the sort of need to reclaim Korean culture, to begin teaching children, right? Korean language, Korean dance, Korean history. And so it was the initiative of Koreans in Japan, with the support of the governments in the North, that they were able to build literally hundreds of schools throughout the islands. And they were viciously attacked by the Japanese governments, although in the 1950s, there was a sort of agreement reached that there would be some capacity for the institutions to remain sort of stable. And those schools still exist today. And the attack that I spoke about a couple of minutes ago is precisely, part of this ongoing struggle that they face. The schools are relatively autonomous from Japanese control because they aren't technically schools. They're considered miscellaneous schools. And there's about 10,000 students in primary and secondary schools. And many of them actually hold DPRK citizenship, because in the early 1950s, Koreans in Japan were deprived of Japanese citizenship. So they were literally stateless. And most chose to affiliate with the North because, of course, in the North, Koreans were in control. And in the South, it was merely a continuation of Japanese colonial rule through US colonialism. And amidst the various struggles and attempts to shut down the schools, one of the really main ways that they went about attacking them was through depriving students and parents the ability of using tuition dollars, and what's the sort of tuition program that the Japanese government provides to Korean schools. And so in 2010, Korean schools were exempted from the sort of free tuition program that the government offers. And again, these are the only schools that are exempt from that. So as a result, the schooling is very expensive. It's expensive, right? It actually costs money, even though Koreans in Japan, of course, pay taxes. And on Friday, we testified to a subcommittee in the Japanese parliament about these schools. I'm a professor of education, so I study education, I teach education. There was another education professor there who teaches teachers as well. And our point was, when you visit these schools, when we take students to these schools, we really see that actually, despite the intense repression and the limited resources that they have, that they're actually, like, the schools, they provide a model for what we in the United States would fight for, right? And not just socialists, but really all progressive people. Right? I mean, can you imagine if in the United States we had schools, that were specifically for the education of all oppressed nationalities, particular oppressed nationalities, and particular oppressed identities? And that's precisely what they're carrying on, to this day. And when you go into the schools, the first thing you notice is that they always talk about our schools, right? The teachers talk about our schools, the principals, the staff, and also the students. They say these are our schools, which is something that's really so foreign to so many of us in capitalist countries. The idea that I would say, oh yes, this is my school. These are our schools, rather than, this is just the school I go to, right? As if because there's always some antagonism between the students and teachers, or the students and the administrators. But with our schools, with the Korean schools in Japan, there really isn't that antagonism. And the reason there isn't that antagonism is not because there's some kind of repression and there's some kind of, military rule in the schools. And in fact, it's really quite the opposite. The first time that I ever visited one of the schools in Japan, it was an elementary. It's the first Tokyo elementary middle school, which was one of the very first schools that they built. And they built them, by the way, with their own hands, all right, with their own labor. Right? It's completely volunteer. The entire community, physically built these schools. I was asked, what my impressions were by the principal. And not being fluent in Korean, I had a translator, Moon Sung, who's a professor at Korean University. And so I thought I would compare it to schools in the United States. And I began and I said, well, in the United States, many people compare schools to prisons. And in fact, there's a whole literature about schools as prisons and schools as, preparation for prison. And Dr. Gum looked at me, looked around and was like at a total loss for words. And eventually Professor Chung, who wasn't able to make it today, he stepped in with the translation. And later on, Dr. Gum said, I'm very sorry I wasn't able to translate that, but what you said made no sense to me, right? And I couldn't really comprehend it in English, let alone translate it into Korean. Right, because the idea that schools would be something like prison is just so foreign, such a foreign concept that there literally wasn't language for them to articulate it as such, because they're really just such precisely the opposite of prisons. Even though there's looking at it from an outsider's perspective, one might think that there is some sort of like disciplinary apparatus within the schools. I mean, when you go in there, no students are on their cell phones. There's very little like crosstalk between students. The respect that teachers and students have for each other is, it's on display. There's a lot of joking around, right? There's a lot of laughter taking place. There's like genuine happiness, right? And there's a lot of spontaneity that's involved in the classroom. People are sort of talking over each other in discussions and critical conversations with each other. So it's really precisely the opposite, of anything like a prison. And that's why they refer to them as our schools. And that's why the Japanese government and imperialism wants to attack not just the political ideology, right, for socialist education, but also its connection to the National Liberation Project, right? Because those two things are not antagonistic. The struggle for national liberation and the struggle for socialism are not contradictory. In our age, they are actually, they go together. They must necessarily go together. And that's a struggle that they're carrying on today. And so we can really see, I think, the theses on socialist education play out in this particular context. And the power of the theses and the ideas put forward, the pedagogical theories and philosophies, as well as the recommendations for institutional practices and the particular organization of the schools. We can see them carried on today, even in the face of immense repression by the government and by racist right-wing groups that will protest outside the schools, calling the students cockroaches and slashing their clothing, such that the students often have to change their clothes when they go into school, because if they wear their traditional clothing on the subways, for example, right-wingers will attack them, will slash the clothing. So under that kind of repression, they're still able to maintain this, to maintain not only our schools and the educational institutions, but also the struggle, the Korean identity, the Korean language, various Korean cultural traditions, as well as, of course, the sort of political project. And so I think it's just very important to demonstrate not only the theses on socialist education and how they play out, but also really the central role that education plays in the Korean struggle in terms of keeping the Korean diaspora connected and the Korean National Liberation Project going. And also in terms of the broader anti-imperialist and the broader socialist project. Education isn't not just being, in other words, a subset of the socialist project or the socialist struggle, but actually sort of one of the key ingredients and the key elements that links the various constitutive factors in those struggles together. Thanks.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.